Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast. You can find out more about the presenters by going to scottishhousingpod.com, and you can also follow us on social media. We are on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok and Facebook. Just look up at Scottish Housing Pod. Joined now by Graham Simpson MSP, and one of the things we always ask any political guest first of all is, how did you get into politics? Were you always a political nerd as a kid, or did you just find that suddenly that's what you were doing?
No, I became a political nerd. But I have to say, before we get into that, this is the first podcast I've ever taken part in.
Is it?
Yeah. And indeed, I've probably managed about 5 minutes of listening to podcasts in my entire life, although my wife is into them.
Right.
So this is a new experience for me. I'm very much looking forward to it. You ask how I got into politics. I remember the moment well. I was in the woodwork class at my school in Carlisle, and my best friend and I were just chatting about the state of the nation. And it was, I guess it was about 1978. Mm-hmm. Labour government coming to the end of the Callaghan government. The country was in a mess, and me and this mate decided to join the Young Conservatives in Carlisle, and that's what we did. And it took over my life for a few years, too much. My schoolwork suffered because I got so involved in politics, but loved it. And then I left. So I left school. I did my A-levels. I didn't do that great. I got the A-levels that I concentrated on, and left school. Didn't go to university. I had been thinking of going to university to do politics, but then I thought, well, actually, I know what I want to do. I want to be a journalist, and I don't need to go to university to do that. So I didn't go to university. I spent a little bit of time on the dole, and I do remember signing on at the same time as my dad. We signed on together, and then I just concentrated on getting my first job and writing to newspapers all around Britain until I landed something, and I got a job in a town called Daventry, working on the local paper.
Oh, yeah.
So at that point, I was a local paper reporter, and it was just not appropriate to be involved in politics. So I wasn't involved in politics.
Yeah.
So I had my career as a journalist, and for most of that career, I was not involved in politics. But I interviewed local politicians, and that was it. So I was completely impartial, and then I came back to it later.
So how did you end up coming up to Scotland for your politics?
I came up to Scotland for work. I was working. I got a job. As at one point, I was working in the northeast of England, living in Newcastle, and then I moved for some reason down to Stoke-on-Trent, which was nowhere near as exciting as Newcastle. But I was working on the paper in Stoke-on-Trent as a sub-editor, and I noticed in the trade magazine, Press Gazette, that the Sun newspaper had started a North of England edition, and were looking for people to do shifts as sub-editors. So I got in touch with them, and I got some shifts, and enough in the end to give up my job in Stoke-on-Trent, moved up to the Manchester area to work on the Sun's North of England edition, but I was just a casual employee, so I wasn't on staff. And I got a phone call to say they were closing it down. But it was at a period where you could get, I wasn't worried. I wasn't married at that point. I just figured I could get work. I knew the Sun had a Scottish edition, so I just phoned them up told them what had happened, and they said, well, come up. So I came up, and I stayed, and got a staff job, and I was there for a long time. And most of the time, really, really enjoyed it. I had a year out at the Daily Record. Came back to the Sun.
Was that missionary work?
I don't know what it was, but it got my salary up. So two increases in salary, and came back to the Sun, which is probably where I felt most at home. And during the time when I was at the Sun, I got back into politics. My name was never in the paper. I was a sub-editor, so it just wasn't an issue. I got back involved again with the Conservative Party, and stood for election, and eventually got elected as a councillor in East Kilbride. And did 2 terms as a councillor, which I loved. It was fantastic. So I represented the area where I still live, in East Kilbride. So rewarding. Just helping the people that, your neighbours, friends and neighbours. And you'll know, because you've been a councillor, you know what it's like.
My perception, so you two both being councillors, my perception is that being a councillor is a bit more apolitical than being an MP or an MSP, because it's much more just day-to-day helping people.
I think that's fair comment. I never really brought party politics into it. It was just about helping folk. I think if you approach it that way, people get to value you.
And people will vote differently at local elections. If you establish, in my experience, me personally, but in my experience, people will value the role of a good local councillor, whether that's general constituents, community activists, different local organisations, if you're doing your job. And if you care about it. And it's also my experience that not long after getting elected in Glasgow, I began to realise that actually, regardless of what political party people were around the table, very little of national politics was relevant to what we were trying to do as a group of councillors together, whether it was at citywide or in local areas.
Yeah.
I think this is an impossible thing to happen, but I often say now when I'm in things like this that it would be great if people were not allowed to have a party political ticket when they stand for local councils, and we could maybe get people elected on the issues that are important to that local ward or to the city. But I know that's just
it's a nice idea, but it's not going to happen. I think it's the way you approach the role, and if you approach it as apolitical, then you can get people's vote, and I did. I mean, when I first got elected, it was the first year of the STV voting system when I got in, and I only just got in. And then when the second time around, when I stood again, I topped the poll as a Conservative in Lanarkshire, and that really bucked the trend then, because colleagues were losing their jobs.
Yep.
But I topped the poll. The reason for that was because I'd worked hard at it, and people knew that I was someone they could approach, and I would usually get things sorted out. Oh, you can't solve everything, but I had a pretty good track record.
And people at least recognise if you're making an effort.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that I think I've always supported proportional representation. Always, I think it's a generally good thing. We might all debate the individual systems, but I think one of the negative things that's happened in Scotland in terms of local government in the last couple of decades, as multi-party politics has become normal in Scotland, a good thing, in my view, is that there's too many people see going into the council as a parliamentary stepping stone. Now, that was always the case. When I was first elected, it was a Labour-dominated Glasgow. It's when I became a supporter of PR. It's because of what I saw in my first term as a councillor. I thought this is not healthy, because people just knew they were going to get re-elected.
Yeah.
and didn't have to work for it. So I went from my first past the post to PR supporter for that reason. But I think one of the weaknesses now, and I know it's just a weakness in politics generally, is too many career politicians. Everyone's a stepping stone. And therefore it diminishes the role of what a local councillor and what that councillor should be, the role they should be playing in the wider local authority.
Yeah.
In terms of governance and, whatever vision or priorities for the wider area. But particularly, I think that the role of being a local councillor is somehow diminished over the years, or how many people view it. And I don't think that's a particular party political thing. I think it's a kind of reflection of all political parties, in my view. Maybe I'm just one of these has-beens that look back with rose-tinted glasses, and I've got an element of, oh, it's not like it was on my day. Maybe I'm turning at my dad. I don't know.
Yeah. Some people use it as a stepping stone. No, that's okay. In my case, I never went into it wanting to use it as a stepping stone. I did it because I enjoyed doing it, and I eventually got into the Scottish Parliament. But I would say that having been a councillor helped me when I got into the Scottish Parliament, and I got in at the right time for me with having had that background. I think if I'd got in sooner, I might not have been ready. I was used to working across party because we had to, and certainly my second term, it was a Labour council in South Lanarkshire, but they didn't have a majority, so they relied on us, the Conservatives, quite a bit at the time, and I had a very good relationship with some people who had 5 years before been sort of enemies politically. So it's strange how you make friends when you have to. But I've just carried that forward. So I find that working across party in the Scottish Parliament is not a problem for me, and I quite enjoy it. It's the only way you'll get things done.
Yeah.
And I think people expect it. I don't think they want people to be too tribal. So some of the wins that I've had, and there was one recently, I know we're not talking about housing yet, but we'll come on to it, where I got an amendment to the Scottish Elections Bill, which would ban the practice of double jobbing, i.e. you can't be an MP and MSP at the same time. That I only got that through because I worked with other parties to get them on board. I know it's just the way it has to be, and it's a healthy thing.
Well,
if the other thing, that you have a reputation for, we've never met properly before, our paths have crossed indirectly. But I think the other thing you have a reputation for is being of independent mind, and that's not necessarily the modern norm in all political parties, the way it perhaps was when we were growing up in politics around the 70s and 80s. I think some of those great backbenchers on both sides of the House and the House of Commons that maybe their primary function was not trying to get to the front bench, but that, they understood the importance of the role of a backbench member of Parliament, of the important role that all parliamentarians have to play. It's not just with the executive, and that involves cross-party. I think you have that reputation as well, Graham. So maybe that was born out of, maybe it's just you, or maybe it was born out of experience of being a local councillor where, it is less party political what you're doing locally, and the fact you run a council that there was a requirement for cross-party work.
I was going to say, do you think there's a bit of two things working in opposite directions? One, all of us as people have views which in 1 minute might fit with the dogma, to put it one way, of one political party, and then a view that might fit with the dogma of a completely different political party. That's the way most humans are. So I wonder if in the increasingly fragmented, we might end up with a 5-party, 6-party state in Scotland after the next election. The negative of that is in the old-fashioned system of the 70s, the Conservative and Labour parties had to be huge, broad churches to be those two big pillars.
Yeah.
And the minute you break it down into multi-party systems where you've got 6 parties, it can become much more fragmented, and that might drive people to be more dogmatic. But the converse of that is the only way you'll ever get anything done in a 5 or a 6 party setup would be you have to work with people. So actually, you've got two elements of a multi-party system working in favour and against each other at the same time.
Yeah.
Do you think that might be the case?
If I could put it this way, if you think about the 3 biggest parties in Scotland, the SNP, Conservatives and Labour, all those parties have a wide variety of views within them.
Mm-hmm.
All of them. If you take, in the SNP's case, if you take away independence, if you just park that, there are people on the left and there are people on the right within the SNP. And within my own party, you will have, there are different views on a lot of issues, same with Labour. So if you can manage it within your own party, you should be able to manage it across party. It shouldn't be an issue.
So, we've talked through your journey of getting to Holyrood, and one of the reasons you're here on a housing podcast, and one of the reasons that I first interacted with you is you've been really big on housing. So again, getting back to the original question about did you get into politics by default or design, did you get into housing being one of the main topics that you are seen for representing and talking about? Has that been by default or design?
It was because I was appointed housing spokesman by Ruth Davidson. And that's what got me into housing.
Mm-hmm.
So I just threw myself at it. And, you've invited me on because you recognise I've got a passion for it.
Yeah.
And even I haven't been a housing spokesman for a good while, but I've retained a strong interest in housing. We'll probably go on to talk about tenements, but I also I convene the cross-party group on housing in the Scottish Parliament, and we've done some really good work on that group. Produced some, I'm biased, but we've produced some very good reports. A lot of these groups in the Parliament, they're just talking shops, but the ones I'm involved in, I don't want them to be that. I want them to actually produce stuff. So we've done this session report on student homelessness, which has come up during the passage of the housing bill, which we might get onto. And rent controls as well, which is also relevant. We did a report on that.
Yeah, well, so housing's become quite I always talk on here about speaking to a journalist 20 years ago about housing, and he said, housing doesn't sell papers, Brian, just ignore it. We don't cover it, so no point in talking to me about it. But it does seem to sell papers now in a different world because there's so many issues. There's been a lot of housing stuff from Stephen and I's perspective. Stephen deals a lot with planning issues and getting stuff built. And I deal a lot things like factoring and property maintenance. So Stephen, you want to ask about the amendment that Graham got through was putting in to do with the housing bill. So do you want to ask about that?
Yeah, I think we'd be remiss of us, given that we're recording today and almost a week to the day after your amendment was passed, and all the little bits of hullabaloo that it resulted in, not least the intervention of the Cabinet Secretary, whom many people, fairly or unfairly, in the general housing industry, including student accommodation industry, has felt has been more silent in housing matters than perhaps others. So it was an interesting week, I think, for many of the people that we work with, and for different reasons. And I thought it would be helpful to know what the thinking behind it was, because I think we've heard one side of the story, which was the response, but perhaps not what the thinking behind the amendment was, and maybe it's related to it. We're quite interested in you referencing the work on the report that the cross-party group done on rent controls and maybe PBSA in general. So we'll be quite interested to hear more about it.
Yes, no problem. So I said that the cross-party group had done a couple of reports. One was on rent controls. It was just an examination of the various types of rent controls that are out there. It didn't come out in favour of rent controls or against rent controls or in favour of any particular type. It was just a study, really, just to say, well, this, if you're going to have rent controls, there are various options, which I thought was a useful report. And the other report that we did was on student homelessness. And I thought that was an excellent report, a number of recommendations for government. But if you take the two together, there are two things going on. One, there's not enough accommodation for students in some parts of Scotland. Mm-hmm. And two, they're very often paying too much. There's an affordability problem for students. And I suppose three, some of them end up sofa surfing. So you could class them as homeless. Now, when it came to the housing bill, which of course is still ongoing, it's been dealt with by two committees. My approach was, well, I really want to look at this issue of student homelessness, and I put a number of amendments in which were looked at the Social Justice Committee. I didn't press those amendments because the votes weren't there. I can readdress them at stage 3 of the bill. And then last week we had amendments which looked at rent controls. So my party, it's no secret, are against rent controls. We think they're generally a bad idea. But my thinking was, well, we're gonna have rent controls. The parliamentary arithmetic shows that. So there is going to be a system of rent controls. So let's, I could just sit back, fold my arms, and go into a strop about it, or do you take my more independent-minded self would be to look at the reality and try and make it a better system. I put forward some amendments which would bring students into any system of rent controls. Now, when I got to the committee last week, I was thinking that I wouldn't be pushing those amendments because I thought I'd had an assurance from the housing minister that he would look seriously at the issue. He may consult on the issue, but unfortunately, it was quite a difficult. I think it was a difficult meeting of the local government and housing committee, because the minister, in my view, unravelled and didn't make those commitments. And there were various members who I could see getting increasingly frustrated at trying to get a straight answer out of him, committing to look at this issue of students, and committing to do something at stage 3 of the bill, and we couldn't get that out of him. So there was this block of amendments on students and rent controls. One of my amendments was first in the group. So if you're first in the group, you are allowed to wind up. So having listened to the debate, I was the last to speak, and I just said, well, we're not getting an answer out of the minister. My recommendation to the committee is to, we need to force the minister to the table. So I think you're going to have to vote for things that you might not actually want. And that's actually what happened. So I ended up pushing amendments that I hadn't intended pushing, just because I thought, well, it's the only way we're going to get the minister to talk. And in fact, the government are now. So yes, I know that caused alarm in the sector, but I think if people in the sector had actually listened to the debate, they'd have seen what was going on. Subsequently, there's been very good engagement, in my view, with Shirley-Ann Somerville, the Cabinet Secretary, and I think you'll see tomorrow that progress has been made, because progress has been made. And then probably over the summer, some more unified thinking between the parties will emerge. So although it was possibly awkward viewing, the result will be the right result.
So do you want to explain to the listeners exactly the detail of the amendment so that...
Yes. So the amendment that has caused an issue was to bring purpose-built student accommodation under any system of rent controls. So that passed.
Which would be seen as the opposite of what someone would expect a Conservative
Correct.
to be involved.
Yes, you wouldn't expect a Conservative to even think of such an amendment.
Yeah, you'd be thinking the Conservatives would be putting amendments in to take stuff out.
Yes. Actually, some of my amendments, which are yet to be debated, do that.
Yeah.
But this one doesn't.
Yeah.
But that's because I've got an interest in students. So I pushed it to a vote and I won the vote, and that has definitely caused alarm. But it shouldn't really have caused alarm if people had watched the debate. So that was the amendment. Passed at stage 2, bringing purpose-built student accommodation into any system of rent controls. I don't think it'll stay that way.
Yeah.
But, that's the way it is at the minute.
Yeah.
And was the main driving force for that the debate around affordability of rents for students rather than availability, or is it both? I mean, the reason I asked that question is the issue of affordability is part of the conundrum about what to do around student accommodation, student homelessness, and affordability. The debate around affordability of rents is it wrapped up in where we've ended up in Scotland with a much higher percentage of foreign students than we ever had before, who frankly are coming from parts of the world and from families who are prepared to pay pretty top dollar for their rents, which is in itself linked to the whole issue about how we fund higher education in the country, isn't it? And is there one, and it's a bigger question, maybe going off slightly off, as I often do in tangents, is there some truth to the fact that one of the weaknesses about our national debates in Scotland is that we don't stand up here and look at all of these issues. I mean, we're just looking at the housing issue, we're just looking at funding of higher ed, very topical as well, over here, and not realising that all of these things are connected.
Yeah, they are. They are connected, very much so. And if you look at the way universities are funded, or not funded, a lot of them are facing severe financial problems now. You could, and Scottish-based students are often losing out on places because they're being cut.
Mm-hmm.
So, youngsters who live here are not able to get the places at universities in Scotland, largely due to the way the Scottish government funds that. If you look at the housing issue, that affects Scottish students as much as it affects foreign students. You could have somebody, living in this area, the Glasgow area, who wants to go to university or even Edinburgh or further afield,
St Andrews, Dundee, Aberdeen.
And they're going to have to leave home. So they're going to have to pay rent. So if rents are too high, which they often are for students, that's a problem. Somebody's going to have to pay that. Quite often parents who can't afford it.
Mm-hmm.
So there is an affordability issue for students, And that needs to be looked at. And I'm pretty certain now that we have a commitment following last week from the government that they will look at this issue. And that's a commitment that, in my view, wasn't there before last week.
What was the government's thinking of not including student accommodation in this debate?
You'd have to ask them. But the whole issue, when rent controls reared its head, there was a huge pushback, which you'll be aware of, from people in the mid-market rent sector, build-to-rent, and purpose-built student accommodation, threatening and in fact doing, pulling out investment in Scotland. So investment's dried up. So I think the thinking is, well, we better leave this alone because we want investment in that sector, which is fair enough.
Yep.
We do. We also want investment in mid-market rent and the build-to-rent sector, but they're currently included in the bill. I think my concern is if you don't exempt all of that, all the money will flood into the purpose-built student accommodation and not the other sectors. It's a risk. So I think over the course of the summer, probably, or before stage 3 of that bill, we all need to get our heads together and come up with something sensible that works for everyone. But we also need to get the investment in.
Because the logic behind leaving the student accommodation out is the same logic behind leaving out mid-market rent and built-to-rent.
Yeah.
And so the logic behind putting them in it is the same logic for putting the student accommodation in.
Correct.
There's no joined up element there. On the housing bill in general, because you talked about it really long, I've long had my suspicions that I'm not 100% certain it will get passed before the elections in May of next year. Do you think it... my cynical head says the Greens left the coalition and the housing bill was shaped a lot around what the Greens wanted. They left it, and we've had the housing minister on, and I sort of joked with him. He more or less went and had a flashing neon sign above his head saying, "This is not what I would have done." Pretty much inside his first week of being housing minister.
Yeah,
which led me along the route of, you're going to kick this can down the road and then it will get to February, March next year and you'll say it's just too late to get this bill through and we'll need to wait until after the election. Am I being too thinking wrongly of politicians or will it happen? What's your view of it?
I think that was a thought at one point, that it might not get through. I don't think that now. I think it will get through. It could have been in an awful mess following last week, but I have to be fair to Shirley-Ann Somerville she has steadied the ship. So I think tomorrow onwards, you'll see a change of tone. So that tells me that what we did last week was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Do you think that the scale of all of these issues, so if you take the fact that we both agree that, for example, the issue around affordability for students and availability is part of a wider debate about that is topical again about higher education, its purpose, its funding, etc., etc. And then the whole general housing issues, which was part of the reason for the housing bill, and recognising that it is arguably the number one issue facing the country is across the whole of the United Kingdom. Does last week's events not make the case, as we often have in this podcast, for the need for a dedicated cabinet secretary for housing?
I've always thought that. Yeah, I think we need it needs to be taken seriously
at cabinet level.
At cabinet level, yes, absolutely. Going back to the point you made earlier, it's a point I always make when I'm speaking about housing. Is it actually doesn't get much publicity although it affects everyone, because we'll need to have somewhere to live. We need to have decent accommodation in decent of decent quality, and we need to be able to afford it. Now that's all correct, but it doesn't get much press attention. It only gets attention when things go wrong. You know, if masonry falls off a building and hits somebody, or there's an explosion, a gas explosion, or something like that.
Yeah, cladding, whatever. Yeah.
Even what happened at committee last week hasn't had much press attention. I think I've read a few lines in one of the broadsheet papers, and I couldn't even get back. I haven't read the whole story because we couldn't get past the paywall. So, but I'm aware of the pushback. Yeah. But it hasn't burst out into the mainstream, and it doesn't.
But where it did burst out is by close of business last Tuesday. Late in London-based investment funds, who are mainly pension funds these days, did know about it. And as you know, part of the pushback was that people who were currently negotiating deals were all put on hold, hopefully just for a few days. I'm sure it resolved itself as the position became clearer. How do politicians who've got to think on their feet sometimes, like you? I mean, I think it would be really helpful. It'd be helpful to. I mean, we don't really know how many listeners we've got, but certainly the people that mentioned to us, they listen to us, the people in the industry, it's really helpful to hear, because there wasn't a lot of media publicity. You talking us through how that came about, it's all now perfectly understandable. So our politicians have got to often think on their feet and to try and pursue their own priorities or the spirit of the bill or whatever. How do we avoid that disconnect? It happens at UK level as well, as where something happens and the immediate effect in the marketplace can be quite dramatic. Maybe some people would argue more dramatic than it has to be.
Yeah.
But these guys and girls that are sitting making these decisions, at the touch of a press of a button to people that are heavily involved in day-to-day projects. So is there some way we can get better at that to avoid that kind of, almost it feels like slightly in our own wee bubble of those of us that are working in the PBSA industry, that for overreaction very quickly that can happen, because markets are like that, aren't they?
Yeah. I'll be honest, I was pretty astonished at the reaction from people who are presumably hard-nosed business people, and I thought, did they not actually watch what happened? Have they just looked at the result? And I think they must have just looked at the result and reacted, rather than looking at the debate that led up to the result. And if they'd watched that, they'd have understood what was actually going on. I think things have calmed down.
Yeah, thank you.
That there have been discussions, private discussions, and I think things have calmed down as they should do. And I think tomorrow, I don't know when this goes out, but
next couple of days.
So I'm saying tomorrow. I'm talking about Tuesday.
So maybe yesterday
of this week. So it might be yesterday. So apologies if you're listening to this and the dates don't quite make sense. But anyway, this week, I think you'll see. You will see a change, and hopefully that will calm things down.
I'm sure it will, and I think it will be helpful, even if it is after Tuesday's further clarity about the position. I think it will be helpful for people that work in the industry that listen to podcasts to hear all that reasoning behind it, because it's now much more, as you say, perfectly understandable.
Yeah, and it's going to be collaborative now, which is good. And what I'd like to see is the MSPs with an interest in this being able to sit around the table with the industry, with stakeholders. I'm convinced that will happen. We'll do that. I may comment on that during committee this week.
I think
we'll make sure to have watched all of it.
Yes,
good.
That's one lesson I've taken away.
I think actually that's really good to hear, because I think the perception of the industry in the early stages of the housing bill was, when I talked about the Greens having quite a bit of an input, I think the industry felt that there was an element of certain people who were involved in creating the bill, taking an attitude of, thanks, your comments are noted, and I really don't care because you're wrong, to the industry. And it didn't matter what the industry said, that there was almost a dogmatic attitude to, I've wanted this to be the housing progress route for the last 20 years, and it's going to happen regardless of what I'm being told. Whereas from everything you've said about politicians, and you've said about politicians work best when they're collaborative, to say this is the general path that I want to take, but I'm open to deviation if people tell me who are working on that area that I don't know so well every day of the week, that might cause issues over here that I hadn't thought about, the unintended consequences. So I think it'd be really useful to hear that more collaborative approach deals with those unintended consequences that maybe was being ignored before.
Yeah.
And I think that collaborative approach is clearly reflected in the all-party working group that you convene in housing, because, many of these groups, as you said, often become talking shops, which in itself, talking shops do have a value. People talking with each other is a good thing, but, something that's much more outcome-based, providing the kind of reports, which probably takes us on to the topic you wanted to
So the other thing that I'm interested in, that's all, a lot of that affects rental market and some element of new build in terms of the pension funds investing in various things. The other thing that I'm really interested in is the other element that you do in the Parliament, and that is the tenement working group. We have, give or take, 500,000, if my numbers are right, roughly 2.5 residential properties in Scotland. Roughly 500,000 of those are pre-1919, and then about 40% of those are tenemental stock. And I know tenement covers any group of flats, so tenements don't necessarily refer to modern flats. Right. Can also refer to modern flats, but when people think of tenements, they think about tenemental stock.
They do.
And I'm really concerned. I obviously work in Glasgow, where we've got 70,000 of those tenement flats. Edinburgh's got about 60,000. I think Aberdeen's got about 4,000 or 5,000 of those pre-1919 tenements. I think Dundee's in the teens of thousands. And I always talk about the tenements of Glasgow, where around about 1980, they were all refurbished. That's 40, 45 years ago, and that's now coming to the end of its working life. And as I was discussing with Stephen just before we started recording, there was an element of, well, they were all refurbished in the 80s. So that then meant the 80s and the 90s, we could forget about spending any money on the tenements because they were only done 5 years ago, then 10 years ago. Now suddenly, and with climate change, again, when you manage properties, you notice, it might sound, rainfall is different. It is, somebody explained to me, it's that, I just call it the big raindrops, but it's the convection rain, it's those flash floods. And so I experience managing tenements. Part of the problem is water now gets to parts of the building that were never designed for water to hit it because of the things like that. So I'm really interested in the recommendations of the tenement working group and what you've been working on. So do you want to explain what you guys have been talking about and working on and where you see it going?
Yeah. If I can give you the background to it. So in the last session of Parliament, a group of us across the party group got together. So MSPs who were aware of the issues around tenements got our heads together, and that ranged from the Greens to SNP, Labour, and ourselves, or myself, from the Conservatives. The Green member involved was Andy Whiteman, who's another independent-minded MSP.
There's not enough of them.
No, there aren't. You're right. So in March 2018, we formed this group. It wasn't a cross-party group. If you form a cross-party group, you're subject to certain parliamentary rules which we didn't want to be subject to, so we called it a working group. So we called it the Tenement Maintenance Working Group, formed that, MSPs, but importantly, people involved in the industry. And we started to have a number of meetings, a couple of site visits, with the aim of producing a report with recommendations. And that's what we did. So we produced a report. Actually, Ben McPherson was I think I'm right in saying, Ben was the original chair. He still retains a strong interest in the subject, but he became a minister, so couldn't chair, and I took over as chair. So the recommendations were there should be compulsory owners associations, sinking funds, and 5 yearly inspections. So quite simple.
Yep.
But behind those, a number of potential issues for people who own or rent tenements. That report went to government, and they commissioned the Scottish Law Commission to look at the Owners Association bit of it. And they have they put something out to consultation. I think they had 79 questions in that consultation, and they will report. I think they may suggest actual legal changes by next year, 2026. So we're into the next session of Parliament. Yeah. So we've gone from the last session of Parliament all through this one, and it'll be the next one by the time we see potential law change in the law or a new law. But it might be proposing, difficult things. It won't be easy for any government, and that's where you're going to need cross-party consensus. So so the background was, there are issues with tenements. There are issues with getting work done often. If repairs need doing, it can often be a problem to get consensus or put the money together.
Yeah.
But I think we need to see tenements, and we shouldn't just be thinking about old buildings.
Yeah, exactly.
You're right. But they are part of the national infrastructure, I think. Housing is part of the national infrastructure. And certainly some of the older ones are quite beautiful buildings. But in Glasgow, in Edinburgh, and other cities, they are part of the fabric of the country. So I think we need to protect them. We need to preserve them. And that's what lay behind this.
The challenge, of course, is anybody who's heard me talk about one of the biggest challenges in property factoring, and this is where, getting back to Stephen's point of, we sometimes look at individual pieces of legislation for a specific matter and don't look at the wider issue. One of the biggest challenges is how difficult it is to enforce payment of debts in Scotland.
Yeah.
So if you've got a repair that's needing done in a building, so one of the things I've heard people talk about is, well, it's brilliant to have the compulsory sinking fund principle, but we can't even get people to pay for the issues that are ongoing at the moment. How are we going to get people to pay for future issues? So it's those types of things that I can imagine the Law Society might also be looking at, because so many things could be written into title deeds that people have to do. Yeah. The development I manage, over 130 flats. It's written in the title deeds, everybody should have white windows.
Yeah.
I get a formal complaint from an owner because somebody's going to put brown windows in the building. But the reality is, that thing in the title deeds is not worth the paper it's written on. Because if I went and took that person to the sheriff to say he should be putting white windows in, the sheriff would go, "You're probably right. Right, see, next time the windows are changed in your flat, change it back to white."
Yeah.
So on paper, the requirement for that guy to have white windows exists. In reality, it doesn't.
No.
And I suppose that's the challenge. That's just me trying to give a small example of it. That's the challenge that you would then have in a lot of what you're proposing. In theory, they are absolutely great and are right. Owners should take more interest in the communal ownership of the communal fabric of their building.
Yeah.
But the reality is, how do you enforce it? How do you make people do it? That will be the biggest challenge, I would imagine.
I agree. It's not easy.
Yeah.
This is not easy. if you're forcing people to do something, let's say you're forcing them to pay a certain amount into a fund. What if you can't afford it? What do you do?
Mm-hmm.
So that'll be one of the issues when, if the next government, whoever that is, decides to legislate in this area, some of it will be controversial, and that's where you might see publicity.
Yeah,
you might get campaigns against some of it, but it needs to be tackled.
Actually, you talked about a paywall. There's so it's in the Tenement Scotland Act that a property factor can reapportion debt to a building if somebody's not paying.
Yeah.
But in general, most factors take that debt on themselves.
Yes.
But from a business perspective, you can only do that for so long.
Yeah.
So I'm aware of a factor that recently then wrote to everybody that had a building with debt and said, we've done everything we can, because there is an element of, in Scotland, you take someone to court and eventually the sheriff turns around and says, okay, we're freezing that person's bank account.
Mm.
But he doesn't ever have more than £1,000 in his bank account, so that's completely a waste of time.
Yeah.
And as you say, people, so this factor has then written to people and say, so we are reapportioning the debt.
Yeah.
And again, it was behind a paywall, so I've not had a chance to
right.
I've not read it all yet, because I want to. But the headline is, can't remember the exact word, but more or less the headline is, look at this terrible thing that this bad factor has done. Bad factor's done nothing. There's bad people in these buildings who have decided that they won't pay their communal share for the communal maintenance and repair of their building, which gives them a financial advantage whenever they come to sell the property. All the factor's done is then use the law to try to say, well, we need paid back. We've given you a building an interest-free loan. We need this paid back. And the tone of so getting back to you, maybe the tone of the way that was written about was, it was the bad factor doing it, when it was bad people. And that will be one of your challenges of, the only way really round it is one of two ways. One is a way that will never happen, which is the government pays for it.
Well,
and the other one is private individuals pay for it.
Yeah. So I wouldn't disagree with any of that.
Yeah.
I would say though that most people, they're good people.
Yep.
They want to do the right thing, but in any walk of life, you're going to get awkward people. And, if you're managing a property portfolio of thousands, there'll be one or two individuals there who just will not want to pay, even though they could pay.
Yeah.
And, you're involved in the factoring industry, you'll know that very well.
And there's a definite line. There is the can't pays and the won't.
And the won't. Yeah.
And I suppose this then feeds into a wider conversation. For the can't pays, part of the reason they own property is perhaps because there is no alternatives for them. They've got into ownership of property because the whole culture around social housing has changed. When we grew up,
around housing.
Yeah.
When we grew up, it was quite reasonable that lots of people lived in a council house.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas now there's a very different perception about living in social housing.
Do you think so?
I think there is still. I think there's you should live in your own bought home is a culture among a lot of people.
But isn't that changing as well with the whole growth of purpose-built private rented accommodation? If investment funds have their way, that's the direction of the housing market in the United Kingdom, and where people expect a lot to be done for them for what they pay every month. So it's cultural change that's potentially around the corner, a significant one, not just about how we fund housing and the kind of profile of house, but it's also about how we live and what we expect others to do for us. I mean, it's quite a dramatic change potentially, and maybe that's what younger generations of people are more inclined to do, because everyone's at the touch of a button.
And I think that's where that conversation that we've had about different bits of legislation feed in to one another. Mm-hmm. I think the Tenement Party Working Group, who are focusing on making sure that our flatted developments are brought up and maintained to the reasonable standard. Mm-hmm. Some of the people who are living in that accommodation should possibly living in a different tenure. So it then comes back to the rent control debate that you had, that makes it easier for private companies to invest in the build-to-rent sector, which widens that side of it, which gives people more options, and they don't feel, well, I'm on the social housing waiting list. There's 150,000. I'm enjoying, as I often say, I'm enjoying 149,000th last place. There's a small group of people who get waiting list turnover so slowly. There's a small group of people who get accommodation because they're in extreme need. And loads of people on their waiting lists are in last place because they're never going to get to the front of the queue. And so their only alternative is to buy property. And so if we had a greater variety of options on the build-to-rent sector, it widens that up.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that point. I would like to see a situation where it is easier for people, if you want to be able to rent, if that's your choice. It shouldn't. Renting shouldn't just be an option for people who are in need, if you like. Or who have
no choice.
Who have no choice.
It should be a proper. You've got multiple tenure choices.
It should be a choice.
Yeah.
So, even if you're on a semi-decent salary, you might just think, well, I'd rather rent.
I don't have to do the repairs. That's part of renting. That's what part of the benefits of renting a property.
That's what I was meaning earlier about expecting other people to do things.
Yeah.
I don't mean that in a. I just mean it's a statement of fact.
Yeah.
I think that is a whole sector that's likely to open up in greater numbers in the UK, partly because it's where markets are driving the funding. Whether we like it or not is a different debate. Maybe we're giving you an idea for another all-party working group or something.
Well, it's a kind of mid-market rent idea,
yes,
isn't it?
Yeah.
But I've always felt this, that housing associations, any of the housing association properties that I've visited are always good. They're good quality. They provide a good service. But you often have to meet certain criteria to even get on their list. So I'd like to see that widened for folk that would actually quite like to rent for various reasons. And it's not just because they don't want to, they want somebody else to do the work. It's just maybe there could be all kinds of reasons. Maybe they think, well, I'm only going to be doing this job for a few years. So I don't want to necessarily lay down roots. So renting might be a good option for me at this point. All kinds of reasons. People have, different lives, don't they? So I would like renting to become an option for more folk than it currently is.
And one of my other things I'll throw in, I would love additional dwelling supplement. In terms of we need work done on the tenements, I'd love it to be thrown into a pot that's ring-fenced for improving our tenemental stock, as opposed to it's just a general tax take. Wouldn't it be great if the tax that was taken off people for buying properties was used to improve the properties that were being bought?
That sounds like a redistribution measure, which I'm rather impressed at the journey you've travelled in your politics over the last few decades.
No, but it's more if society thinks that our tenemental stock is worth preserving, then society should maybe help do it. And if we're going to charge private landlords an additional tax for buying an additional property, and it's a large tax, then make that tax specific to what they're dealing with. So if we are going to be charging landlords 8% for buying a second and a third and a fourth and a fifth property and whatever, then use that additional tax that we've generated to help those people who are in private, who own their own property but are struggling to maintain the common fabric of the building. Use it for that reasons, to keep our tenemental stock going, as opposed to it just goes into a general pot and gets wasted. There's some benefit.
So there's your third idea for a new working group.
I'll give an answer that ministers often give. I'll take that away and reflect on it.
Yes.
Graham, as we get near the end of our podcast, we like to end on a more light-hearted-ish, kind of softer point or conclusion or question. So I think the one that springs to mind for me is, will we continue to see the independent-minded Graham Simpson somewhere post the 2026 May election, or maybe even see a return back to where real work gets done in a council somewhere?
I don't know the answer to that, because I don't know what's going to happen next year. And I'm still thinking about what I do, whether I stand. I'm actually still thinking about that. But whatever happens, I would like to be contributing to the areas that I'm interested in, which are housing in this case, transport. I'm also passionate about. So whatever I do, yes, I'll still be independent-minded. I'm really glad you said that, but if that's people's view of me, then I'm happy with that.
I think that's what we need. Politicians who are passionate about what they do, rather than politicians, as you said, who want to become the leader of something.
And we need people like that as well. We need people that want to be ministers, but a strong country, in my view, and certainly a strong democracy, needs people who want to be parliamentarians first and foremost. And for me, and the same at council level, that requires a degree of independent-mindedness and, more power to the many in every party that have it. So wherever you're contributing, I hope you play a role in encouraging people with independent minds to do more.
I'll do that.
So for me, it's been a very enjoyable podcast.
Yes, excellent. Yes, thank you very much.
Nice
thank you.
Good.
To meet you, Graham.
Thanks for listening to the Scottish Housing Podcast with Stephen Purcell and me, Brian Gilmore. To ensure you don't miss an episode, please follow us and subscribe wherever you pick up your podcasts. To find out more about the presenters, go to scottishhousingpod.com, and to get all the latest information about forthcoming guests and new episodes, follow us on social media at Scottish Housing Pod.
The Scottish Housing Podcast is brought to you by the Right Business Centre. Located just off the M8 in Glasgow, we have office space to suit all companies from the smallest startup to a large corporate business. Right Business Centre also provides virtual office services like mail handling, creating a seamless virtual operation for remote teams or startups. Whatever your business needs, go to rightbusinesscentre.co.uk.
Welcome to the world of hassle-free property management with Indigo Square. As a premier residential lettings and property factoring service, we pride ourselves on tailoring our services to meet the unique needs of each client. Whether you're a landlord seeking a professional agent to handle the complexities of new legislation, or a homeowner in a shared building looking for seamless repair solutions, Indigo Square has got you covered. Say goodbye to stress and hello to peace of mind with Indigo Square. To discover how we can simplify your property management experience, visit our website at www.indigolits.com or drop us a line at info@indigolits.com. Your property deserves the best. Choose Indigo Square.
Introducing 2010 Land Consultancy, a dynamic and specialized team of experts dedicated to navigating the complex world of public affairs, planning consultancy, and business development. Based in Glasgow and serving clients across the UK and beyond, our agile team offers unparalleled expertise to public, private, and civil society organizations. With a strong network of connections in Scotland and beyond, Stephen brings invaluable insights and strategic guidance to every project. So choose 2010 Land Consultancy for innovative solutions, unparalleled expertise, and a commitment to driving success for our clients.